December 19, 10:42 a.m. St. Augustine Medical Center. I was standing outside the room where my grandson had just been born when I heard my son shout, "Don't let her in. Grace says my mother lowers her energy. Just tell her she's not family." I froze, still holding the container of warm stew I'd brought for them. Then my phone buzzed. Responsible payer update. $14,870 charged to Linda Harper. Assigned by Adam Harper. In 1 minute I was denied my grandson and handed a bill for his birth. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. How could they do this to me? If you stay with me, I'll tell you how that moment broke me and how it rebuilt me. My name is Linda Harper, and at 65, I believed I had weathered most storms a life can offer. I was raised in a small mill town and learned early how to stand up without making noise, how to be steady when the world shook around me. When my husband died in 1998, leaving me with a boy who still slept with a stuffed bear, I promised myself that Adam would never feel the kind of emptiness I carried. I worked 3 jobs, laundering hotel linens at dawn, cashiering through long afternoons, and keeping night records at the bus depot. Every dollar I earned was bent toward Adam's future. Every choice I made was shaped around him. For years he saw me as his anchor. He used to draw crayon pictures of the two of us on the sofa, wrapped in the knitted blanket my mother made, the same one I still keep folded over the armchair. He would press it into my lap and say, "You're my whole world, Mom." I believed those words with the unguarded faith only a young mother can have. I believed they would last. But children see differently as they grow, and partners see differently still. Grace entered Adam's life with the soft confidence of someone accustomed to admiration. She carried lavender perfume, crisp handbags, and a certainty that rooms should adjust to her. Her family lived in the northern suburbs, in a house with white columns and a dining room large enough for the parties they loved to host. They welcomed me politely, but I felt the edges of their smiles, the faint hesitation before they handed me a plate, the way conversations slowed when I stepped into the room. Grace's mother once told me, while smoothing the tablecloth, that they valued elevated environments. I nodded, unsure what that meant for someone like me. Over time it became clear. I was welcome as long as I caused no ripple, cost them nothing, and fit the quiet outline they preferred for me. To Adam, I tried to remain the mother he knew, the one who packed tins of lemon cookies when he visited, the one who remembered every appointment and sent him home with extra soup. Yet he grew more careful, more polished, more eager to impress. When he spoke to Grace's family, I saw him straighten his posture and soften his voice, as if rehearsing for a role he hoped they would approve of. I, meanwhile, felt myself shrinking to fit the corners they placed me in. They treated me as a gentle convenience, the person who could watch the dog when they traveled, who could fill in last minute when they needed errands run, who could contribute quietly and without acknowledgement. A free hand, a silent wallet, a body to occupy the farthest seat at the table. I do not think they hated me. Indifference, I've learned, can be its own kind of unkindness. They simply never imagined that a woman like me, widowed, practical, carrying decades of quiet work in her shoulders, had needs of her own. Still, I loved my son, and I wanted to believe that love was enough to keep me from disappearing in the bright world Grace built around him. Whenever doubt threatened to rise, I reminded myself of the boy he had been, the child who held my hand crossing busy streets, the teenager who left sticky notes on the fridge that said, "I love you, Mom," the young man who hugged me tight the night he got his first acceptance letter. But the truth was simpler and harder. They had begun to see me not as a person but as a resource, a background figure, someone whose life remained available for withdrawal, like a savings account they assumed would never run dry. And in small ways, by staying quiet, I allowed it. Before the day at the hospital, I still held on to hope that my place in Adam's life could be restored with the birth of his child. I imagined myself holding the baby, introducing him to the blanket I had kept all these years, whispering the same lullabies my mother once sang to me. But that hope would soon dissolve into something sharper, an understanding that I had mistaken proximity for belonging. I share all of this not to cast myself as a martyr, but to show the slow drift that can happen between a parent and an adult child when silence replaces conversation. Looking back now, I see how easily small dismissals become patterns, how quickly gratitude can fade when convenience takes its place. I did not resent them then. I simply stood on the edges, hoping the circle would widen again. What I did not yet understand was that circles do not widen by waiting. They widen by truth, by boundaries, by the courage to name what hurts. And at that time I had not yet found my voice. Even so, I held on. I told myself that families bend, repair, and find their way back. I believed that if I just stayed patient, the warmth we once shared would return. But patience, I learned, cannot heal what others refuse to see. And in their eyes, I had become invisible long before that winter morning. The first real shift did not come with shouting or confrontation. It arrived quietly, like a small draft through a window I thought was sealed. It was the night of Adam and Grace's engagement party, held in her parents' sprawling living room where soft jazz played and waiters circled with trays of sparkling water. I wore a navy dress I had saved for special occasions, smoothing the fabric every few minutes, reminding myself to breathe. I remember standing near the mantel, studying a photograph of Grace's family on a beach, each of them tanned and smiling in matching linen. I felt out of place, but I held on to the hope that kindness could bridge any distance. That was when I heard her voice, low but unguarded, just behind me. "She's too simple," Grace whispered to Adam. "We'll need to limit her involvement." For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood. The words were so soft, as if they were meant to dissolve into the music. But they didn't. They lodged themselves in me like a pin. I stood still, my fingers wrapped around a glass of water I suddenly felt embarrassed to be holding. Adam didn't respond right away. He merely glanced over at me, then back at her. His face held an expression I hadn't seen before. Anxiety mixed with eagerness, like someone hoping for approval. Finally, he nodded, barely perceptible but enough. That small gesture, the quiet agreement, was the first true fracture. Not deep yet, but unmistakable. The party moved on around me. Laughter rose, glasses clinked. People exchanged warm compliments about the future bride and groom. I tried to blend back in, offering smiles when someone looked my way. But inside me, something was shifting. I felt like a guest in a life I had helped build from the ground up. Later that night, I returned home, hanging my coat on the hook by the door, the one Adam used to reach for when he was little. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light casting a pale circle across the wood. I replayed Grace's words again and again. Too simple. What did that mean? Did kindness now look like simplicity? Did working hard make me unrefined? Or had I simply become an inconvenience in the world my son was trying to enter? I traced the grain of the table with my fingers and whispered to myself, "It's just nerves. She doesn't know me yet." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to protect the picture I held of my son's future, one where families blended instead of collided. But deep down, I felt the truth lifting its head. A warning that something foundational between Adam and me had shifted. It was small enough to ignore but large enough to remember. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened. But the air around us changed. Grace began choosing restaurants for family dinners that were far beyond my budget, insisting they were casual. Adam started dressing differently, speaking differently, laughing with a sharpness that felt rehearsed. When I visited, Grace often excused herself to another room, leaving the three of us in a triangle of polite conversation worn thin. And still I told myself it was fine. Looking back now, I understand that these early cracks do not announce themselves with sirens. They arrive like faint tremors, quiet, nearly ignorable, but carrying the future within them. They show you where the fault line will someday split wide open. They show you what you refuse to see because love can make you blind to the simplest truths. This was the beginning of my erasure. Not the loud betrayal at the hospital, not the bill that arrived on my phone, but this moment, this whisper behind my back, this small nod from my son, this first quiet fracture in a bond one believed was unbreakable. I share all of this not to cast myself as a martyr, but to show the slow drift that can happen between a parent and an adult child when silence replaces conversation. Looking back now, I see how easily small dismissals become patterns, how quickly gratitude can fade when convenience takes its place. I did not resent them then. I simply stood on the edges, hoping the circle would widen again. What I did not yet understand was that circles do not widen by waiting. They widen by truth, by boundaries, by the courage to name what hurts. And at that time, I had not yet found my voice. Still, the memory of that whisper clung to me like the faint scent of perfume on a borrowed scarf. It followed me into the grocery store, into my quiet evenings, into the moments when I folded laundry or prepared meals. It was the first sign that I was being gently moved aside, placed somewhere out of sight, where my presence would not interfere with the picture they wanted to present. The months after the engagement passed quietly, but the quiet had an edge to it, like the thin crack in a teacup that has not yet broken but will. Small humiliations began appearing in ways so subtle I almost convinced myself they were accidents. My calls went unanswered for days, then weeks. When Adam finally returned them, his voice carried a practiced cheerfulness that never reached warmth. He always seemed to be in a hurry, always about to enter a meeting or leave one. At gatherings, I was placed at the farthest end of the table, often with relatives I had never met. Grace orchestrated the seating with a smile, guiding people to their places the way someone arranges centerpieces. Whenever I reached for conversation, she leaned in to redirect it elsewhere, as if gently steering a wandering pet. I told myself she was merely overwhelmed, that brides often felt the need to control details. But each time I was moved a little farther away from the center of things, something in me tightened. The deepest sting came from the ordinary moments where I had once belonged. I found out about their pregnancy not from Adam, but from a photograph posted online. A pair of tiny shoes beside a calendar marked with a heart. My phone buzzed with notifications from friends before my son ever thought to call me. I stared at the image for a long time, tracing the edges of the shoes with my thumb as though touching them might bring me closer to the child I had not yet been allowed to anticipate. When I reached out, Adam responded hours later with a short message. "We were going to tell you this weekend. Things have been crazy." I wanted to be happy for him, and in some small way I was. But beneath that joy sat a thin thread of grief. There are moments a parent waits a lifetime for, and learning about a first grandchild through a screen felt like losing something I could not name. Still I tried. I began knitting a blanket, soft cream yarn with a simple pattern my mother taught me when I was 12. I worked on it during late evenings, the sound of the needles clicking against each other soothing my nerves. I imagined handing it to them. Imagined Adam recognizing the effort woven into each row. But when I sent it with a kind note, Grace replied, "We prefer organic store-bought items. Yours looks itchy." No thank you. No acknowledgement of the hours. Just the dismissal. I folded the blanket and placed it in a drawer, though the weight of it remained in my hands for days. The smell of the yarn lingered in the room, a reminder of a door that had quietly closed. Other small acts followed. When I offered to help with anything, appointments, nursery decorating, errands, I was told, "We have it covered." When I arrived with a casserole after a long week for them, I watched Grace set it aside untouched, later claiming they were avoiding heavy foods. When I mailed a birthday card to Adam, he sent a brief text. "Got it. Thanks." Gone were the long calls, the shared jokes, the easy affection. The erosion came slowly enough that I kept searching for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Grace was anxious about becoming a mother. Perhaps Adam was overwhelmed by work. Perhaps families simply outgrow the shapes they once held. But deep down, a quiet certainty was forming, a sense that I was being deliberately moved to the periphery, as though my presence complicated the image they wished to maintain. I began noticing the pauses in their voices when I said I might stop by, the careful phrasing they used when declining my offers. Even their smiles felt different, pleasant, polite, and detached. I recognized those smiles. I had given them many times to customers at the grocery store. Courteous, efficient, never intimate. By autumn, I realized I was living on the outskirts of their life, watching events from a distance. My voicemail filled with appointments I no longer attended, dinners I was no longer invited to, milestones I learned about only after they passed. The silence between us grew not into peace, but into absence. I told myself that once the baby arrived, things would soften. A child, after all, has a way of rearranging hearts. But as winter approached, a thought emerged that felt both unbearable and undeniable. Perhaps they were preparing for a future where I existed only as a background figure, called upon when convenient, dismissed when not. And that is how erosion works. Not in a single storm, but in 1,000 small tides, each one pulling just enough to change the shore without anyone noticing until the ground beneath your feet has disappeared. I tried to hold the line, telling myself that love could still find its way through the narrowing gap between us. But every time I reached forward, they stepped back just enough for me to feel the distance. It became clear that I was being taught my place, not through cruelty but through careful omission, the kind that leaves no bruise yet still wounds. The morning Grace went into labor. I woke before sunrise. The air in my small kitchen felt still, as though the world were holding its breath. I brewed a pot of tea, poured it into my favorite mug, the one with a chipped rim Adam painted in second grade, and placed the container of homemade stew beside it. I wanted to bring something warm, something familiar, something that would remind my son of home. By the time I reached St. Augustine Medical Center, the December air had settled into a brittle cold. The parking lot glistened from an early frost, and the hallways hummed with that muted urgency hospitals carry. I asked the receptionist for their room, smoothing my scarf as though neatness might grant me acceptance. I approached the door quietly, listening for a moment before knocking. I heard shuffling, a baby's weak cry, the rustle of fabric. My heart swelled. Then before I could lift my hand to knock, I heard Adam's voice, sharp, tense, unmistakably strained. "Don't let her in," he said. "My mother embarrasses us. Grace said she doesn't want anyone lowering her energy. Just tell her she's not family here." I froze. The container slipped slightly in my grasp, its warmth sinking out of the plastic as though retreating from me. I stood so still that even the air seemed to stop. His words pressed against my chest, cold and heavy. The nurse stepped into the hallway, her expression caught between discomfort and duty. "Ma'am, they need a little more time." More time. The words felt like a dismissal wrapped in politeness. I nodded because nodding was something I could still manage. I stepped back, leaning slightly against the wall. The stew cooled in my hands. The newborn's cry faded. I felt the moment harden inside me, like a memory forging itself without my permission. Then my phone buzzed. A notification glowed across the screen. Responsible payer update. $14,870 assigned to Linda Harper. Authorized by Adam Harper. For a long second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked. The numbers stayed. The bill for the room they would not let me step into. The room where my grandson had taken his first breath. The room that now felt farther from me than the moon. The nurse shifted, clearing her throat gently. "I'm sorry," she murmured, lowering her gaze. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice had slipped somewhere I couldn't reach. I felt a slow, sinking understanding fall through me, like a stone descending into deep water. This wasn't simply exclusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. A deliberate one. Adam's words echoed again in the hallway. "She's not family. Not family. After everything. After decades of sacrifice, of nights spent working double shifts, of birthdays celebrated with store-brand cake and laughter we made ourselves. After all the times I held him when the world frightened him. After every scraped knee, every whispered reassurance. I stood there until the hall grew quiet. Until the container of stew felt like nothing in my hands. Until the cold clarity settled in my bones. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not broke but rearranged itself. Something that had been dormant began to wake. Anger, yes. But more than that, understanding. A clean, sharp knowing that I had been pushed out not by accident, not by circumstance but by intention. I walked out of the hospital slowly, the crisp air burning my lungs. The winter sun hung low, casting long shadows across the pavement. I placed the stew in my passenger seat and sat for a long time without starting the engine. Inside the car, the silence felt enormous. My phone sat in my lap, the $14,870 notification still glowing. A number that should have meant care, support, family working together. But instead it was proof. Proof that they did not want me in their lives, only in their finances. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the small ridges beneath my fingertips. I whispered to myself, "This is the line." The sound of my own voice startled me, quiet as it was. I had spent months trying to ignore small humiliations, making myself smaller, gentler, easier to accept. But that day, standing outside the room where my grandson was born, listening to my son deny me, something resolute formed inside me. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just truth. I turned the key in the ignition and drove away from the hospital, The weight in my chest no longer confusion but clarity. The road stretched ahead, unfamiliar and bare, but my hands felt steady on the wheel. And though I did not yet know what steps I would take, I sensed that a threshold had been crossed. I could no longer pretend not to see what had been unfolding. I could no longer excuse the coldness, the distance, the quiet erasure. Standing outside that door had shown me everything, who they were becoming, and who I could no longer be for them. That day did not just end a chapter. It marked the beginning of my awakening. I checked into a small roadside motel that night, the kind with doors that open directly to the parking lot, and a heater that hums like an old refrigerator. The clerk handed me a key attached to a plastic tag, and I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle in my palm. Room 14. I let myself inside and locked the door behind me as though I were holding back a tide. The room smelled faintly of cleaning spray and stale air. A single lamp cast a yellow circle across the thin bedspread, and the heater clattered in uneven bursts. I set my coat on the chair, placed my wallet on the table, and stood in the middle of the room without moving. The silence felt different here. No hospital monitors, no footsteps in the hallway, no voices telling me where I did or didn't belong. I opened my wallet slowly, not out of habit but out of ritual. Inside were the same things I had carried for decades. A worn photograph of Adam at age 10, my library card, a small grocery receipt tucked into the corner. I touched each carefully, as though confirming they were still mine. Then I looked at the credit card that had paid for every emergency, every crisis, every time Adam said, "Mom, can you help?" I had never hesitated before. I had never asked for repayment. The card had been my promise. But that night it felt like a door I had left open too long. I placed it on the table, the plastic clicking lightly against the wood. Then I turned off the lamp. Darkness settled gently, giving me space to breathe. In that dim room, the truth shaped itself with painful clarity. I had been offering love, and they had been taking access. I had given them my trust, and they had treated it like a utility, something to switch on when needed and off when inconvenient. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the heater's hiss, and whispered the only words that felt honest. Never again. I didn't mean it with anger. I meant it with recognition. A boundary I should have drawn years ago was finally tracing itself across the floor of that motel room. The next morning, when the sun rose through thin curtains, I felt strangely steady. My chest still ached, but the ache was clean, like a wound washed with cold water. I dialed the hospital, pressing each number with deliberate calm. "This is Linda Harper," I said. "My name has been incorrectly assigned to a bill. I did not authorize it. I will not pay it. Please remove me as the responsible party." The woman on the line sounded startled, then apologetic. She confirmed the paperwork would be corrected. No questions asked. No resistance. As though the entire burden I had been carrying had never truly belonged to me. After the call, I sat back and exhaled. Not in relief but in resolve. I realized then that every moment of humiliation, every dismissal, every quiet exclusion had been preparing me for this single act of clarity. Not revenge, not withdrawal, just self-respect. I blocked Adam's number, then Grace's, then every relative or friend who had treated my presence as optional and my generosity as an obligation. With each contact removed, the phone grew lighter in my hand, as if shedding the weight of years. I expected to feel guilt. Instead, I felt space. In that space, memories began rearranging themselves. Not the painful ones, those had always spoken loudly, but the quiet ones I had overlooked. Times when Adam had taken my help without acknowledgement. Times when Grace had accepted my labor without gratitude. Times when I had allowed myself to believe that patience was the same as love. But the clearest realization was this. The person I had failed the most was not Adam. It was myself. I had silenced my own needs so thoroughly that I no longer recognized them until they were trampled. In the motel's dim bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection. Lines shaped by years of effort, eyes dulled by exhaustion, shoulders that had carried more than they should have. And yet, beneath that, I saw something returning, something I had forgotten to protect. A steadiness. A dignity that had been waiting for me to notice it again. I brushed my hair back and said softly, "I'm here." It was the first time in a long while I had addressed myself with any tenderness. As I packed my things, the room already felt smaller, as though it could no longer contain what I had reclaimed. I stepped outside into the cold morning air, the frost sparkling along the edges of the walkway. My breath rose in small clouds, each one feeling like a release. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The realization had settled into me fully. I could grieve the loss of the family I thought I had, while still choosing a future that honored who I was. The two truths could exist together. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of the keys in my hand, familiar and grounding. The world had not changed overnight, yet something essential within me had shifted. I was no longer waiting for an apology that would never come, or a gesture that would rewrite what had already been spoken. I was no longer trying to earn a place in lives that had chosen to move without me. Clarity does not arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly, often in a bare motel room with thin curtains and a humming heater, when the truth has nowhere left to hide. Mine told me this. I could love my son, but I did not have to carry the cost of his choices. I could wish him well, but I no longer had to sacrifice myself to keep him afloat. I started the engine, feeling the vibration beneath my palms, and for the first time in years, the road ahead did not frighten me. It simply waited. After I left the motel, life did not suddenly become neat or heroic. I still had to go home, unlock the same front door, step into the same quiet rooms where Adam's childhood clung to the walls like old wallpaper. The dent in the hallway from when he crashed his toy truck. The faded growth chart penciled on the pantry frame. The knitted blanket folded over the armchair. Nothing in the house knew what had happened at that hospital. Only I did. I set my keys in the small ceramic dish by the door and hung my coat on the hook. For a moment I simply listened, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, to my own breathing. This was the life I had built. Not flawless, not grand, but honest. And I realized that if I did nothing, if I allowed that day to pass like all the other quiet humiliations, I would be choosing to abandon myself yet again. So I began with what I could control. First, I took out a small notebook from the drawer beside the stove. It was the same one I used for grocery lists and borrowed book titles. This time I opened to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What changes now?" The ink felt heavy on the paper. Underneath, I listed every way my life had been woven into Adam's. The emergency credit card he knew about, his name on my spare house key, the automatic transfers I had set up to help them through the first years, the life insurance policy where he was the sole beneficiary. Seeing it all written down was like turning on a harsh light. I had not just supported him. I had structured my future around his needs, assuming he would treat that gift with care. I picked up the phone and called my bank. The representative confirmed my identity and asked how she could help. "I need to cancel an authorized user card," I said. My voice did not shake. Within minutes, Adam's access to my account was removed. No drama, no persuasion, just a quiet click of keys on her end and a confirmation number on mine. When the call ended, I stared at the paper where I had written credit card and drew a firm line through it. Next came the automatic transfers. I logged into my online banking and opened the scheduled payments. A monthly sum that had been moving from my account to theirs, labeled family support. My finger hovered over the cancel button. For a moment, I saw Adam as a young man again, calling me from his first apartment, embarrassed to admit the rent had gone up. "Mom, just until I get settled," he had said. That had been 10 years ago. I pressed cancel and watched the confirmation message appear. The screen did not flare or celebrate. It simply acknowledged the change. I added another line through my list. I still went to see the lawyer who had helped me with my will. The receptionist offered me a date the following week. I accepted without explanation. When I sat across from his desk, I felt like someone quietly moving furniture back into the right rooms after a long, disorienting storm. "I'd like to adjust my beneficiaries," I said. "And I want to make sure no one can access my funds without my direct consent." We updated the will. I redistributed what little I had set aside, not as punishment but as protection. I added a clause specifying that no medical or financial responsibility could be assigned to me without my written agreement. When I signed the papers, the pen felt steadier in my hand than it had in years. At home I changed the locks. Not because I expected Adam to arrive with anger, but because I needed the physical symbol of a new boundary. I held the cool metal of the new keys, feeling their unfamiliar teeth. I thought of all the years I had given him unrestricted access to my home, my time, my money, my heart. It was time to offer that same access to myself. The final step was the simplest and the hardest. I wrote a letter. I sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of plain paper and my favorite blue pen. No accusations, no dramatic flourishes. Just the truth. I told Adam I loved him. I told him what had happened at the hospital from my side of the door. I told him about the bill, the assignment of my name without my consent, and the words "she's not family." I did not argue with him or ask him why. I simply stated that from this day forward, I would no longer participate in any arrangement that treated me as a resource instead of a person. I will not fund a relationship in which I am unwelcome, I wrote. My door is open to respectful conversation, but closed to financial dependence. I hope one day you will understand the difference. I signed my name, folded the letter, and mailed it the next morning. There was no immediate response. No phone call, no apology, no rush to explain. The silence that followed was not new, but it felt different now. It was no longer something being done to me. It was something I had chosen as well. For the first time, distance did not feel like exile. Felt like air. It felt like room enough to stand upright. These were not grand gestures. No shouting, no ultimatums, no scenes. Just a series of quiet decisions, each one anchored in a simple belief. I had the right to protect myself, even from the people I loved most. In the weeks that followed my decisions, the quiet around me deepened, but it no longer carried the sting of abandonment. It felt more like a room finally cleared of clutter, space where I could breathe. I didn't know then what the ripple effects would be for Adam and Grace. I didn't wish them hardship. I only wished for my own peace. Still, consequences have a way of finding their path, especially when built on choices long overdue. The first sign came as a letter slipped under my door. Misdelivered mail from their old address. A thick envelope from a bank. I held it for a moment, debating whether to forward it, but the return address told me everything I needed to know. Overdraft notices. Multiple. I set the envelope aside, neither opening it nor returning it. Their finances were no longer my responsibility, and the boundaries I had drawn remained steady. Not long after, a mutual acquaintance mentioned in passing that Adam had lost his job. Restructuring, she said, though the hesitant pause told another story. I imagined him sitting in a small office, hearing words he never expected to hear, realizing perhaps for the first time that safety nets do not always appear when needed, especially when their source has finally closed the gaps. Grace, it seemed, handled the pressure less quietly. Word drifted through the thin social channels I still occupied that she had moved temporarily back to her mother's home with the baby. Some said she blamed Adam for the financial strain, for the house payments they could no longer meet, for the lifestyle that had begun unraveling thread by thread. A house that once held curated dinners and polished surfaces now sat on a realtor's listing page, stripped of its shine beneath the phrase, "priced for quick sale." I learned, too, that when the hospital billing department attempted to charge Adam for the delivery suite, he called them repeatedly, insisting there had been a mistake. But the paperwork was clear. My name had been removed. His signature remained. And no amount of arguing could undo that. Their friends, the ones who once filled their home with laughter and expensive wine, began to thin out as well. People disappear quickly when admiration turns to inconvenience. I knew this not because I witnessed it, but because silence travels. The absence of updates, the shrinking orbit around their lives, told me enough. I did not celebrate any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching things fall apart. But I understood now that much of what they had built had rested on borrowed ground, borrowed money, borrowed image, borrowed generosity. And when the borrowing stopped, the structure simply could not stand. Months passed, and the updates grew fewer, softer, as though life was teaching them through gradual lessons rather than sharp blows. A cousin mentioned that Adam had tried reaching out to several acquaintances for temporary help, only to find their kindness thinner than he remembered. Grace, too, found the edges of her world narrowing. Her carefully curated social media presence grew sparse, replaced with uncaptioned photos of the baby taken in dimmer rooms. Love could remain. Boundaries could remain with it. Both truths could exist without canceling the other. It wasn't my place to rescue him anymore, nor his to rely on me as if nothing had changed. Life was adjusting around that reality, shaping itself into something more honest. I did not watch their struggles directly, but I felt the shift in the air, like distant thunder signaling a storm someone else would have to walk through on their own. In quiet moments, I allowed myself to hope for their steadiness, the kind built not from leaning on others, but from standing on ground finally recognized as one's own. Consequences had arrived not as punishment, but as clarity, a mirror held up gently to the choices they had made, and the ones I finally chose not to make for them. A full year passed before I saw Adam again. It was late evening, early winter, the kind of night when the air feels thick with quiet and the world seems to draw itself inward. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes when a knock sounded at the door, 3 hesitant taps spaced far apart, as though the visitor feared the answer. I dried my hands on a towel, breathing slowly, preparing myself for anything except the sight that met me when I opened the door. Adam stood on the porch, thin from strain, shoulders slumped beneath a worn jacket. His hair, once carefully styled, fell messily across his forehead. In his arms he held a toddler bundled in a soft blue coat. My grandson, the child I had not been allowed to hold on the day he entered this world. "Mom," Adam whispered, barely audible. I didn't know where else to go. The porch light cast a pale circle around us. His breath puffed in uneven clouds. The child stirred, resting a small hand against Adam's collar. I stepped back, allowing them inside not out of obligation, but out of a gentler instinct, one that still recognized the boy who once hid behind my legs during thunderstorms. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had written the letter that changed the course of things. The air smelled faintly of the lavender candle I kept burning in the evenings. Adam folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then tried again, as though searching for a version of himself that could speak. "I know I did wrong," he said. "I know what I said at the hospital. I can't explain it. I thought." He broke off, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Everything fell apart after that. The house, the job, the marriage. Grace left. I don't blame her. I don't blame anyone but myself." He lifted his eyes to mine, and for a moment I saw the frightened young man he had once been, the one who called me after his first failed exam, who asked if I thought he was capable of becoming someone better. "I have nothing left," he said. "I'm asking for forgiveness and help, just for a little while. Please." I looked at him then, really looked, the fatigue in his face, the regret woven into every word, the tremor of a man facing the consequences of his own choices. My heart softened, but not in the old way. Not in the way that dissolved my boundaries or erased my needs. This softness came with clarity. I reached across the table, not to take his hand, but to steady my voice. "Adam," I said quietly, "I am not angry with you. I haven't been for a long time. But I can't return to the person I was before. I can't rescue you at the cost of myself." He nodded slowly, though the understanding hurt him. His eyes glistened. "I will always care for you," I continued. "But I will not be your emergency bank account. I will not be the person you call only when everything else has failed. If you want to rebuild your life, I'll encourage you. But the work has to be yours." The child in his lap shifted, reaching toward me with a small, curious hand. I smiled gently, touched his fingers, felt the fragile warmth of a life just beginning. A life untouched by the mistakes of his parents. "You can come by," I said softly, "to talk, to let the baby play. But not to lean on me in ways that break me. This is my boundary. It's not punishment. It's protection, mine and in the long run yours." Adam swallowed hard, nodding once more. "I understand," he whispered. We sat for a while longer in the quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the small coos of the child exploring my kitchen table with wide, earnest eyes. Eventually Adam stood, adjusting the toddler against his shoulder. "Thank you for letting us in," he said. "Good night, Adam," I replied, steady but warm. When they left, the house felt neither empty nor full, just honest. I closed the door gently, placing my palm against the wood for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Forgiveness had come, but on my terms. Love remained, but trust did not rush back. And boundaries, those quiet lines I had drawn in a motel room more than a year ago, held firm, shaping a new way of being in each other's lives. I stood by the window after they left, watching the faint trail of their footsteps fade into the frost. I felt no triumph, no ache, only steadiness. Boundaries were not walls. They were doorways with conditions, allowing connection without surrender. And that was enough. Life after all of this did not become a fairy tale. It became something quieter, smaller in some ways, but more truthful. I stopped measuring my days by the messages I did or did not receive from Adam. Instead, I began to notice the sound of my own life again. The kettle whistling in the morning, the pages of a book turning beneath my fingers, the way sunlight moved slowly across the living room floor. I started volunteering at the local library 3 afternoons a week. At first, I chose it because it felt familiar. Books had always been my refuge when the world grew too loud. The library smelled of paper, dust, and the faint sweetness of the hand soap in the restroom. Children came with their parents, tugging at sleeves, pointing at bright covers. Older regulars arrived like clockwork, asking for the next mystery in a series or returning a stack of romances with shy smiles. My job was simple: shelving, guiding, listening. But in those simple tasks, I found a sense of usefulness that did not demand my savings or my silence. People thanked me for helping them find what they needed. No one asked for my credit card. No one questioned my worth. On weekends, I tended a small garden behind my house. Tomatoes mostly, and a few herbs in mismatched pots. I liked the feel of the soil under my fingernails, the way tiny green shoots push stubbornly toward the light. Growth, I learned, is often quiet and unseen until one day it is simply there. A red fruit in your palm, warm from the sun. Occasionally, Adam brought my grandson to visit. The boy's laughter filled the house in a way that felt both new and familiar. He grew to recognize the jar of wooden blocks I kept on a low shelf, the soft blanket I had once folded away, now spread on the rug for him to tumble across. Adam and I spoke gently, carefully, like people building a bridge plank by plank. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic reconciliations. Just consistent, respectful visits, each one reinforcing the boundary I had set and the love that remained. I traveled a little too, in modest ways. A bus trip to the coast to watch the gray waves roll in against the rocks. A train ride to a nearby town with an art museum I had always meant to see. I brought a small notebook with me, jotting down details, the smell of salt in the air, the way strangers' conversations wove together on public transport, the particular blue of a painting that stayed with me long after I left. At home, my evenings became my own again. I cooked simple meals, sometimes trying new recipes from worn cookbooks. I called friends I had neglected during the years when my life revolved around Adam's crises. We talked about ordinary things. Health, neighbors, a television show we both followed. I realized how much I had missed this ordinary companionship, free of obligation and expectation. There were lonely moments, of course. There were days when I saw a family out together, a grandmother proudly pushing a stroller surrounded by children, and felt a sharp ache in my chest. But the ache did not undo me. It sat beside the steadiness I had cultivated, one honest feeling among many, not the only one. My home grew quieter but not empty. I filled it with small rituals that belonged solely to me. A cup of tea in my chipped mug at exactly 8 in the evening, a lavender candle lit as the sun went down, a stack of library books waiting on the coffee table. The knitted blanket stayed on the armchair now, not as a relic of what might have been, but as a simple comfort I allowed myself. I no longer begged for space in anyone's life. I no longer rearranged my needs to fit into corners offered to me out of convenience. Instead, I stood fully in the life I had, tending it the way I tended my garden, patiently, attentively, without apology. Adam's path remained his own. Sometimes he shared small victories, a new job interview, a parenting milestone, a moment when he caught himself before repeating an old pattern. I listened, offering encouragement without stepping in to fix or fund. Other times, weeks passed without a visit, and I let them pass without panic. Our connection was not what it once had been, but it was honest. And honesty, I had learned, was more valuable than any illusion of closeness built on obligation. In this new balance, I discovered a quiet freedom. The freedom to be kind without being used, to be present without being consumed, to love without abandoning myself. In the quiet of my home now, I often sit with a cup of evening tea and let my thoughts settle the way dust does in a sunbeam, slowly, gently, without rush. I think about the day my grandson was born, the closed door, the words that cut through me, the bill that tried to tie me to a place where I was not welcome. That day shattered something I had carried for decades. But it also uncovered something sturdier beneath it, my own worth. I once believed that being a mother meant giving without limit, forgiving without pause, returning again and again to the same wound hoping it might someday soften. But life has taught me a quieter truth. Love is not proven through exhaustion. It breathes best where there is respect, honesty, and room enough for both people to stand whole. Adam and I are finding our way, slowly, carefully, without pretending the past did not happen. And I have found my way back to myself. Steady, grounded, no longer trying to earn a place that should have been mine by right of love alone. If my story touched something in you, then you belong here. Subscribe to hear more truths spoken softly, where silence becomes strength.